Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, November 3, 1879. 5:47 in the morning. The rivets did not match anything Thomas Garrity had ever held in his hands, and he had held more iron than most men in the county would touch in 3 lifetimes. Newcastle, Pennsylvania. The plate was cold enough to take the skin off his palm if he gripped it wrong, and he gripped it wrong on purpose, because the cold told him something the daylight wouldn't. Garrity was 36 years old. He had been the railroad's contract armorer for 11 years. The man called when a locomotive strongbox jammed, when a signal lock corroded shut, when a foreman's safe needed opening because the combination had died with the foreman. He did not collect anything. He fixed things, professionally, for a wage. And he had built his reputation on never once being wrong about a piece of metal in 11 years of being asked.
That morning, he was doing what he did every morning before the rail yard woke up, oiling the lock mechanism on the tool shed door, a small, ordinary task, the kind that didn't require thinking, which was exactly why he was still thinking about the dream he'd had the night before, something about his father's anvil, when the foreman's boy came running down the cinder path with a canvas sack held away from his body like it had teeth. The plate inside the sack had come up out of a collapsed gallery less than 2 hours earlier, brought to the surface by men clearing rubble from a roof fall in a drift mine outside town, and somebody had decided, correctly, that Garrity was the man in Newcastle who would know what it was.
He unwrapped it on the bench in his shop, under the one window that actually let in clean light, and he did the thing he always did first. He ran his thumb along the rivet line before he looked at anything else, because his hands knew metalwork before his eyes did. The riveting was wrong. Not damaged wrong, not old wrong. Wrong in a way that meant whoever had set those rivets had never been trained by anyone Garrity could place.
He had repaired German breastplates brought over by collectors who wanted them restrung for display. The tight, even, almost obsessive spacing of the Nuremberg school. He had handled Italian work too, looser, more decorative, rivets used as ornament as much as fastening. This plate's rivets sat in a pattern he had never been taught to read, set at intervals that didn't correspond to any apprenticeship lineage he knew by name, and Thomas Garrity knew every lineage that had ever crossed the Atlantic into a Pennsylvania collector's parlor, because identifying them was, in a sense, half his trade. He smelled rust, and under the rust something fainter, mineral and sweet, like a struck match held too close to wet slate. He did not have a word for it. He turned the plate over in the light for 11 minutes before he said anything to the boy waiting in the doorway. Then he wrapped it back in the canvas, told the boy to tell the foreman he'd have something written down by the end of the day, and sat alone in his shop with the door shut for the rest of the morning. By that afternoon, a man none of the regular mine clerks recognized had already come and gone from the foreman's office, and the foreman told Garrity, without explaining why, that the written report should be brief. But here is what the Smithsonian Institution has spent 145 years making sure you never ask about. Lawrence County in 1879 was iron country in the most literal sense the word could carry. The Shenango Valley ran with furnace light at night, and Newcastle's economy was built, brick by brick, on coal seams and the iron ore hauled up from drift mines cut into the hillsides west of town. Men did not go into those mines looking for anything except a wage that would feed a family through winter. Garrity's own father had worked a forge in Cumberland County before the family moved west. And Garrity himself had apprenticed at 14, not out of romantic attachment to the trade, but because a boy who could read iron correctly could always find work, even in a depression year. And 1879 sat at the tail end of one of the worst the country had seen. There was no incentive for a working mine crew to invent a discovery. A found object meant a stopped shift. A stopped shift meant lost wages. And the men who hauled that canvas sack out of the collapsed gallery were losing money in real time the moment they decided it was worth the walk into town. The crew that pulled the plate free numbered 6, working under a drift boss named Hollis Vance, 44 years old, 19 years in Lawrence County mining before that morning.
Vance had a habit, well known to the men under him, of refusing to let anyone leave a roof fall until every loose stone was accounted for. a caution that had kept his crew's injury record cleaner than any other gang working that hillside. And it was Vance's insistence on clearing the fall completely, rather than just enough to resume hauling, that brought the plate fully into the light rather than leaving it half buried under shale. The timberman on the crew, a Welsh immigrant named Idris Pugh, 29 years old, in his 6th year underground, was the one who first touched the rivets and said, to no one in particular, that he'd never felt iron set together like that in his life. Not in Wales, not here. The lamp boy, barely 16, knew enough to the work that this was his 2nd month underground, dropped his lamp when the plate came free of the shale. Not from fear exactly, but because his hands simply stopped obeying him for a second, the way hands sometimes do at the edge of something they don't have a category for. Has anyone in your family ever worked underground? Mining, construction, drainage? Ask them what they were told to forget. Some of them will tell you, some of them won't. The earliest verifiable account of an iron find resembling the Lawrence County plate predates it by 8 years.
In 1871, a drainage crew working outside Connellsville, in Fayette County, struck a fragment of plated iron while cutting a culvert through a hillside, and the foreman on that job, a man named Asa Pruitt, 41 years old at the time, with 17 years of railroad construction experience, wrote a short account of it in a letter to his brother in Ohio, a letter that survived in family hands and was eventually deposited in a regional historical society's manuscript collection decades later. Pruitt described the fragment as resembling armor, but unlike any breastplate he had seen pictured in an encyclopedia his employer kept in the field office. And he noted that a man identifying himself as a federal land surveyor arrived at the site within 4 days of the find, examined the fragment for less than an hour, and left with it wrapped in burlap, giving Pruitt a receipt that listed the item only as geological specimen, iron oxide concretion. Pruitt kept that receipt. It does not match the description of what he had actually seen. There is one detail in Garrity's written report to the mining company that I am choosing not to read aloud in full. Not because it isn't documented, because I have spent considerable time deciding whether it should travel further than it already has. I will tell you what it implies without reading you the words. Garrity's report included a measurement of the plate's thickness that, if accurate, places it outside the range any 19th century or earlier hand-forging method could reliably achieve at that level of consistency across the full surface. The number exists in his daughter's papers. I am not going to read you the number. I am going to tell you that when a metallurgist at a Pittsburgh foundry was shown a transcription of Garrity's notes in the 1950s by Garrity's granddaughter, the metallurgist's only comment, recorded by her in a margin note, was that the thickness tolerance described would have required equipment that did not exist in any forge operating in Pennsylvania in 1879, or for that matter in Europe. I told you the federal surveyor reached the Connellsville site within 4 days of Pruitt's discovery. What I did not tell you is that the travel authorization for that same surveyor, recovered decades later by a researcher working through Department of the Interior records, is dated 2 days before Pruitt's letter to his brother was even written. Someone knew before the discovery was reported. Someone had already authorized travel to a hillside in Fayette County for a find that, according to every surviving local record, had not yet happened. A second case surfaced 4 years after Lawrence County, in Mercer County, just north along the same iron belt, in 1883. A well-digging crew working a farm outside Sharon struck a buried iron helm at a depth of 19 feet, well below the frost line and well below any depth a buried cache from the colonial or early Republic period would plausibly reach. The farmer who owned the land, a man named Otis Dunmore, 53 years old, 3rd generation on that property, refused at first to let anyone remove the helm from his land, and his refusal is documented in a brief item that ran in the Sharon Weekly paper that autumn, an item that was never followed up in any subsequent issue. A representative of a Pittsburgh museum arrived at the Dunmore farm within 6 days of the newspaper item running. Dunmore later told a neighbor an account preserved in that neighbor's own family Bible as a marginal note beside a birth record, that he had been offered $80 for the helm,
a sum equivalent to several months of farm income at the time, and that he had taken it because he had 4 children and no inclination to fight an institution over a piece of iron he didn't understand and didn't particularly want buried under his cellar floor anyway.
A third case, 6 years later, in 1889, in Beaver County, southwest of Lawrence, where a quarry blast exposed a cache of plated iron fragments embedded in limestone that geological surveys of the period dated, by stratification alone, to a depth inconsistent with any deposit younger than several thousand years. The quarry's blasting foreman, a man named Cornelius Strait, 38 years old, 12 years in quarry work, reported the find to the company office the same afternoon. By the following morning, 2 men identifying themselves as representatives of the Smithsonian Institution had arrived, examined the fragments, and removed them in a single wooden crate, leaving behind a 1-paragraph acknowledgement that listed the contents only as mineral specimens of local geological interest. Strait's own diary entry from that night, preserved by his family and eventually donated to a county historical archive in 1961, describes the fragments differently, as iron worked by hands, not by ground, his exact phrase underlined twice. A fourth case completes the pattern across this same belt of Pennsylvania counties. In 1894, a railroad grading crew cutting through a hillside near Volant, back in Lawrence County itself, less than 15 miles from where Garrity had examined his plate 15 years earlier, exposed a fragment of similar ironwork during excavation for a new spur line. The crew's foreman that day was, by an irony the historical record does not explain, a younger cousin of Hollis Vance, the same drift boss who had overseen the 1879 find.
That foreman, a man named Eli Vance, 26 years old, in his 4th year of railroad construction, sent word to his older cousin before sending word to the company office, a decision Eli Vance later described, in a brief interview conducted by a local historian in the 1930s, as instinct rather than procedure. He said he wanted someone who'd seen something like it before to look at it first. Hollis Vance, by then 60 years old and retired from active mining, came to the site within hours, examined the fragment, and reportedly told his cousin only that it matched what had come up 15 years before, almost to the rivet.
The company's official accident and incident log for that excavation lists the delay caused by the find as geological obstruction, routine, with no further description. Eli Vance's personal recollection, recorded decades after the fact, is the only surviving account that contradicts the company's characterization. What I just described, 4 separate iron finds across 4 Pennsylvania counties over 23 years, each one met by federal or institutional removal within days, each one logged afterward as an ordinary geological specimen, is one sequence from a documented series. The full record is in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The metallurgical anomaly at the center of the Lawrence County plate is not a matter of style. It is a matter of physical property.
When the granddaughter of Thomas Garrity had a small shaving from the plate's edge tested in 1962, the sample reportedly showed a phosphorus content inconsistent with the bog iron smelting techniques used in both medieval Europe and any documented pre-industrial American iron production. Phosphorus content in iron is not a stylistic signature.
It is a direct record of the smelting temperature and the ore source, and an anomalous phosphorus reading means either an ore deposit that does not match any known regional source, or a furnace temperature control that 19th century bloomery forges, let alone medieval ones, could not reliably sustain. A blacksmith working with a hand-pumped bellows and a charcoal-fed bloomery achieves temperature swings that show up in the metal's grain structure as inconsistency. The Lawrence County plate's grain, according to the same 1962 analysis, showed almost no such swing across its surface. That consistency requires either a level of furnace control that places the object's manufacture far outside any known 19th century capability, or an age and an originating metallurgical tradition that the official timeline for human ironworking in North America does not currently accommodate at all. That is what the analysis says. The plate itself has not been independently retested since 1962. No public institution holds a sample.
The granddaughter's papers note that she mailed the original shaving to the testing laboratory in a small tin marked in her own hand, "Grandfather's iron, return please." It was not returned. The Smithsonian's involvement in the broader pattern of Pennsylvania iron finds is documented through the institution's own annual reports to Congress during this period, which list incoming specimens of disputed origin from field collectors and unnamed correspondents across multiple eastern states, without itemizing what those specimens were or where specifically they had come from.
A researcher named Holloway Bream, working through these annual reports in the 1970s as part of an unrelated study on 19th century museum acquisition practices, noted in his own unpublished research file that the category "specimens of disputed origin" appears with conspicuous regularity in years that correspond almost exactly to the dates of the Pennsylvania iron finds: 1871, 1879, 1883, 1889, without a single one of those specimens appearing in any subsequent published catalog of the institution's holdings. Bream's notes were donated, along with the rest of his research papers, to a university archive after his death, and they remain there, unindexed beyond a general folder heading, available to anyone willing to make the trip and ask for the right box. The institution's official statement, issued in response to a 2018 inquiry from an independent researcher who had compiled the Pennsylvania iron cases into a single written request, says no specimen matching the description of plated iron armor from Lawrence, Fayette, Mercer, or Beaver counties was ever received or cataloged by the Smithsonian Institution in the 19th century. The statement does not address the annual reports to Congress listing unitemized specimens of disputed origin from the same counties in the same years. It does not mention those reports at all. The framework that fits this pattern of evidence is not a new one, and it does not require abandoning the physical record to entertain. Across the Appalachian Iron Belt, and at sites further west along the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, researchers working outside institutional channels have documented a recurring class of metallurgical and architectural finds: worked iron and unidentified alloys recovered from strata inconsistent with any colonial, indigenous, or pre-Columbian European presence as currently taught, that collectively point toward a continent-spanning, technologically capable civilization, whose physical traces were systematically collected and removed from public record in the same decades the Smithsonian Institution was consolidating its authority over American archaeological and geological specimens. This is the Tartarian hypothesis, the proposition that a sophisticated pre-19th century civilization existed across North America and was deliberately erased from institutional memory during the period of westward expansion and federal consolidation. It is not offered here as settled fact. It is offered as the framework that the Lawrence County Plate and the three corroborating finds that followed it across 23 years in the same iron belt fit more completely than the official explanation of misidentified geological concretions does. A global parallel exists at Kanpur in northern India, where iron pillars dated to the 4th century show a corrosion-resistant composition that 20th century metallurgists could not initially replicate using any documented ancient Indian smelting process. A separate continent, a separate century, the same unanswered question about furnace control nobody alive in either era is supposed to have possessed.
The economic value of the Lawrence County mine at the time of the find has been estimated, based on regional production figures for comparable drift mines in 1879, at roughly $11,000 of annual ore output, a substantial sum for a single hillside operation in a depression year. The mining company's official reason for halting work on the affected gallery, recorded in a brief company memorandum preserved in a regional business archive, cites structural instability following roof collapse as the cause. That explanation does not hold up against the company's own subsequent actions. Surveys conducted the following spring, recovered from the same archive, rated the adjoining galleries as fully stable and authorized continued extraction within 30 feet of the original collapse site. while the specific gallery where the plate was found remained permanently sealed, at a cost, itemized in the same memorandum, of timber, fill material, and labor amounting to nearly $400, a sealing expense that exceeded what 6 months of continued extraction from that single gallery would have yielded.
A company does not spend $400 to seal off $11,000 of recoverable ore unless the cost of leaving it open is calculated as higher than the value of the ore itself. The land above that sealed gallery is today held by a holding company registered in Delaware, with no listed employees, no public-facing business activity, and a registered agent whose address corresponds to a known federal contracting firm's filing office.
The parcel was acquired by this holding company in 1994, purchased from the mining company's corporate successor for a sum that public county records list as nominal, well below assessed value for comparable acreage in the area. There is a chain-link perimeter fence around the old mine entrance, erected sometime in the early 2000s according to satellite imagery comparisons, and a single surveillance camera mounted on the gatepost, a camera whose housing is visibly newer than the fence it sits on.
A Freedom of Information request filed in February 2021 by independent researcher Marguerite Aldis, requesting any Smithsonian Institution field correspondence, acquisition logs, or internal memoranda referencing iron specimens collected from Lawrence, Fayette, Mercer, or Beaver counties between 1871 and 1894 was denied in full, citing an exemption intended to protect internal deliberative communications from disclosure. That exemption exists to shield ongoing policy discussions from premature release, not historical acquisition records more than a century old, and Aldis's appeal of the denial, filed that summer, has received no further response as of this recording. Have you ever stood somewhere that a government agency later put a fence around? Not a crime scene, just fenced, for reasons that were never quite explained. Tell me where. Thomas Garrity did not speak about the plate again publicly for the rest of his working life. He continued as the railroad's contract armorer for another 19 years, retiring in 1898, and by all accounts of the men who worked alongside him, he was regarded as the most reliable judge of metal in 3 counties, a reputation built, his own family later said, on a stubborn refusal to guess. It was that same refusal that made his silence afterward conspicuous to the people who knew him best. His daughter, in an interview conducted by a regional folklore researcher in 1951, when she was 71 years old, recalled that her father kept a single drawer in his workshop locked for the rest of his life, a drawer she was never permitted to open as a child, and that when he died in 1911, the drawer was found to contain nothing but a single sheet of paper bearing the original measurements he had taken of the plate in 1879, along with a short line in his own handwriting that the daughter chose not to fully repeat to the researcher, saying only that it ended with the words, "I have never been wrong about iron before, and I have never wanted to be wrong about anything more." It was Garrity's granddaughter, Edith Marsh, 81 years old in 1962, the year she finally had the metal shaving tested, who gave the most complete account on record of what her grandfather actually believed. In a recorded conversation with a regional historical society that was filed away and largely forgotten for decades before being rediscovered by a researcher cataloging the society's audio holdings in 2009. Marsh said her grandfather told her, when she was a young girl and he was an old man, that the rivets on that plate had been set by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone trained as thoroughly as he himself had been trained, by a tradition he simply could not place. And that not being able to place it, for a man whose entire professional identity rested on being able to place exactly that, had bothered him more than anything else in his working life. He said, "I knew iron my whole life, and that iron knew something I didn't. I never told the company that. I told them it wasn't European and let them think that was the whole of it." Marsh's recorded account was rejected for inclusion in a planned regional history publication in 1963 on the grounds that it could not be independently verified, and the recording itself sat uncatalogued in the Historical Society's basement for 46 years before a volunteer archivist found it during a building renovation and recognized the name Garrity from an unrelated file on Lawrence County mining accidents. The detail that corroborates Marsh's account,
and that she could not plausibly have fabricated, is the measurement sheet itself, which surfaced independently among a separate batch of Garrity family papers donated to a different archive in the 1980s, decades before Marsh's recording was rediscovered, listing thickness figures that match, almost to the decimal, what the 1962 metallurgical analysis would later find anomalous. Thomas Garrity was 36 years old on the morning the boy came running down the cinder path with the canvas sack held away from his body.
His hands were still slick with lock oil when he took the plate from the sack and ran his thumb along the rivet line, the way his hands always moved before his eyes caught up with what they were touching. The plate itself, Edith Marsh's recorded account makes this much clear, was never returned to the family after the company took final possession of it in late 1879. It is not in any public collection. It is not listed in any institutional inventory under any name researchers have yet located. Wherever it sits now, it sits exactly as it sat on Garrity's workbench that November morning. Cold, riveted by hands that trained nowhere a working armorer in Pennsylvania could ever place them, and silent. The hillside outside Newcastle is not the only ground in this county that was sealed within a year of something coming up out of it that nobody